1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. While you're turning there, last time we're seeing the victory through suffering. And Christ sets that example for us, and then we get to follow that. But the victory was accomplished by Christ, beginning with our redemption. Jesus wasn't a victim of the circumstances of the cross. As we said last time, it's a miracle that they even killed him at all because of the illegal trials and the circumstances and all of those things. It was a plan of God. Even his arrest that Jesus planned by going to the same place every night. And so he wasn't a victim of those circumstances. He was a victor through the events of the cross. And Jesus suffered in the ultimate way. You can't suffer any more than suffering that ends in death. And he suffered that way. But he suffered for sin, but he was innocent. It's the just for the unjust, as Peter describes it here. But any suffering that we may face in this life is ultimately tied to our own sin. We caused suffering in the world. The sin of man brought suffering to the world. There was no suffering before Adam and Eve sinned and every other one after that, except for the Lord Jesus Christ. So we're not innocent, even though there are times when we are going to suffer for righteousness' sake and not sin. But Christ suffered once for sins, just like the picture of the Day of Atonement that we talked about. The Day of Atonement was to cover all sin for the year. They did that once a year. All of the other sacrifices were about restoring fellowship between a person and God. Same as when we get saved once, but we still sin. So we don't get saved over and over again. We pray and ask God to forgive us and restore fellowship. The same picture there. And so Christ had to take our place in order for there to be victory, and then we would have to assume his righteousness in order to be qualified to go to heaven. And there was a purpose for Christ's suffering, to bring us to God. And that's the same victory that we can experience when we suffer unjustly. We can help others to receive Christ and be saved also. So we're going to continue the same idea of victory in suffering in these next verses here. We'll read the same verses we read last time, 1 Peter 3, 18 through 21. He says, "For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. By which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. The like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God by the resurrection of Jesus Christ." And we're going to pick up there in verse 19 this evening, and this is after the victory of the cross. There is a triumphal message. The word for preached there in verse 19 is kerusso. Now that's a familiar Greek word. You might not recognize that. I don't say it a whole lot, but it means to herald. It's a public crier. I always think of the goofy Robin Hood cartoon movie where what's the buzzard, and he's giving out the time, and he does this public cry, this herald. What is it? What's he say? 4 o'clock and all well, or something. And the other one says, I don't know, it's only 2 o'clock, or he ain't even get the time right. But that's always what I think of. It's just goofy. But that's a public herald. That's the same kind of idea. Just anybody who will listen. And that's the same word that's given in the Great Commission in Mark 16:15 when he says, "And he said unto them, Go ye into all the world and preach." Kerusso, that's that same word. Preach the gospel to every creature. That's not directed to just preachers. That is directed to all Christians. We are to proclaim the gospel to every creature publicly, anyone who will hear. In verse 18 we saw Jesus has been put to death in the flesh. And so that's his physical death. But spiritually, he is very much alive here in verse 19. There is no such thing as soul sleep. If you've ever heard that term before, soul sleep, that's where a person believes that they die and then their soul is basically asleep for a long period of time, and then at some point when they wake up and something else happens. That's not biblical. When a person dies, their conscience right after that. There's no period of sleep or unconsciousness or anything. They are immediately either in the presence of God or they're being tormented. They're in a place of hell and they're waiting for the final judgment, the great white throne judgment there for the unsaved and the judgment seat of Christ for the saved. But they're in a spiritual body somewhere after death and very much alert and aware. And we were created in God's image. We are eternal beings. Now, not from eternity past like God is, but from the moment you were conceived in the womb, from that period on, we are eternal beings. We have a spirit. We have a soul. Those things are eternal. They will always exist from that point on there. And so no one is annihilated. Some believe in annihilation, where they believe those who are ungodly are just destroyed, that they're just burnt up, just consumed. They no longer exist anymore. That's not true either. We know you're either in God's presence and you're rewarded for eternity, or you're in the absence of God and you're punished for eternity. There's no annihilationism. It's either eternal death or eternal life, depending on what a person chooses to do with God. But verse 18 also says that Jesus is quickened by the Spirit. Now, what's that word quickened mean? Made alive. Made alive. Now, you read that verse and it says Jesus is quickened by the Spirit. He is made alive because of the Holy Spirit. Now, that's not the resurrection yet. That's not what that's talking about. Because at the resurrection, He's not made alive by the Spirit. He's made alive in the what? The flesh. In the flesh. That's the resurrection. So this is not the resurrection here. It was Jesus's, now think about this a second, don't answer right away, but just think about this. Was Jesus's spirit dead and now it's alive again? You'd instinctively say, I said don't answer, but but you'd instinctively say no, because God is eternal. You'd instinctively say that. But, and it's not the same as when the body dies and is resurrected back. But think about this for just a minute. What's the definition of spiritual death? Right? Also called the second death. What's the actual definition of spiritual death? Well, separation from God. That's what spiritual death is. Separation from God. Those who die without God, the first death occurs, physical death, and places them in a temporary place of torment called hell. We know that's not the final place of torment. The final place of torment for the unsaved and the demons and Satan and his host is where? The lake of fire. That's where death and hell are cast into. That's their final place. And that is when hell is removed from the earth. It's in the center right now. And so that's the temporary place would be hell. Right? And so, but when they're in the temporary place now that we know as hell in the center of the earth, it's not technically complete separation from God yet. Right? Because you see there in the earth that there is one side, which is the torment side. Right? If you know the story of the rich man and Lazarus, right? The rich man died, And in hell he lifted up his eyes and he's tormented. And he asked Abraham, just send Lazarus, just dip his finger in the water to cool my tongue, for I'm tormented. There is some type of communication back and forth, even though Abraham says there's a great gulf between the two. Even if we wanted to go over to that side, we can't. And so there's a separation point, but you can see it's not complete separation from everything associated with God, because those on the paradise side, or Abraham's bosom, they are comforted by God, even though that's not their final place yet either. The complete separation from God doesn't happen until Revelation 20. Look at Revelation 20 and verse 14. And this is what we were talking about earlier. This is the complete separation from God forever. In Revelation 20:14, and death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. Now, until that point happens, it's not complete separation from God yet. Hell is then removed from the center of the earth, as we said, cast into the lake of fire, swallowed up, as Jude describes it, in the darkness. It's the blackness of darkness. There is no more light after that period of time. In hell, even though they're in the darkness, they can see out to some degree. Right? And so when it's cast into the lake of fire, there's no more light. It's complete darkness, complete blindness. Right? Same picture as spiritual blindness. After that point in time in the lake of fire, there's no contact with God ever again. Never. That's the definition of spiritual death. Complete separation from God. Now, did Jesus experience spiritual death? Did he experience separation from God? Yes. Yes. Right? We know that from on the cross, Matthew 27:46. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? There is complete separation, because at that point in time, he has taken on the sin of the world. And God cannot look upon sin. And there is that complete separation there. I believe it's the 3 hours of darkness. When that happens, the darkness is on the earth. I believe it's the same picture of the lake of fire that's swallowed up in darkness, and there's no contact with God. And so I believe that happens for that whole 3 hours there, and which would be a miserable experience for Jesus to have to deal with that for 3 hours, when he has never experienced that for even 1 second throughout the rest of eternity, up until that period of time. But Jesus had to do that. In order to be punished for sin, to take the full punishment of sin, he has to experience not only physical death, but spiritual death. That's the consequences of sin apart from God. And so in order to bear the full punishment of sin, that has to happen. So Jesus is alive in the Spirit when we see these verses in 1 Peter. But he's still dead in the flesh. His body is still in the ground. He's not been resurrected yet. Right now, where did he go during that time? In verse 19 of 1 Peter 3, back in our original text, he says, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. Now, Jesus' spirit, we know, doesn't go through judgment. There is no eternal death, no second death for Christ, but he goes to where those souls are, where those who are experiencing. Yes, it's hell. It's hell there. Now, is Jesus a preacher? That's not a trick question. Is Jesus a preacher? Yes, of course, the best one that ever walked the earth, best one who ever will walk the earth. Of course, he's a preacher. Now, when a preacher shares the gospel in a public setting, it's not the word caruso. It's not that word that we talked about earlier from the Great Commission, go into the world and preach the gospel to every creature. That's caruso. That's proclaiming it. Every Christian is supposed to do that. That's not what happens when a preacher does that in a public setting. When a preacher does that in a public setting, right, that word is euangelizo. That's a different Greek word there, which means to announce the good word or evangelize the gospel. It's the same idea. It's just done to a group. And he's holding that position there, but it's still preaching the gospel. Now, it would be no benefit for Jesus to go to these souls who are imprisoned and preach the gospel to them, to evangelize them. Why not? Well, if people got a second chance to believe the gospel and to be saved after they had gone to hell, how many people would be there? None. Nobody would be there. If you went there for 5 seconds, 10 minutes, whatever, if you went there for any period of time whatsoever and you got another chance to get out, everybody'd be out. Right. Yeah, everybody'd be in heaven. That is not accurate there. So Jesus is proclaiming something, kerusso, but it's not the gospel. Right? It's not that. It has to be something else. And you see that. He's proclaiming the victory that he has had over the curse of sin through his own death. That was for us, but he's free. He took on the penalty of sin. He suffered physical death. He suffered spiritual death. And yet he's free. He's not bound like those people are in that place called hell. He's not condemned like those who are paying for their own sins. The sacrifice has been accepted. He's been victorious over sin. And now he's proclaiming that to them in that place there. And so the message of triumph isn't necessarily directed to those who have died and gone to hell, even though their spirits of the unsaved people are imprisoned there also. But this is probably directed to the fallen angels who are there also. That's who this is directed to. The word spirits, just to give you an example of that, Matthew 8:16. I'll read a few of them. You can go look these up on your own just to prove it for yourself. If it doesn't say something like the spirit of man or something like that, every time you see the word spirits in the New Testament, this word here, it is always talking about angels. It's always talking about angels, unless it specifies the spirit of man or something like that. But in Matthew 8:16, he says, when the even was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed with devils, and he cast out the spirits with his word, and healed all that were sick. Luke 6:18, similar language here. I'll just read a few of them. He says, and they that were vexed with unclean spirits, and they were healed. And Luke 7:21, one chapter over, he says, and in that same hour he cured many of their infirmities and plagues and of evil spirits, and unto many that were blind he gave sights. And so you see them called spirits, you see them called unclean spirits, you see them called evil spirits. They're all demons. They're fallen angels. That's what he's describing in those verses. The holy angels, by the way, are called ministering spirits. It's a different phrase for them. Hebrews 1:14, are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for them who shall be heirs of salvation? So the holy angels are used to serve us, help us. Those are ministering spirits, and so they get a different title. And so we can assume that this message of victory is directed at the demons, because it says to those spirits in prison, and they are trapped in hell at this time. Now, all the demons are forever locked to a fate of destruction. They're all going to the lake of fire eventually. Not all of them are in hell right now. We understand that. Some are in the earth, some are in the heavens, but they all have the same fate. Hebrews 2:16 describes that they're not redeemed creatures. They're not like us. And in Hebrews 2:16, they can't be redeemed. They were with God, and then when they chose to leave with Satan, they were cast out, or follow Satan, they were cast out. But he says in Hebrews 2:16, for verily he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. Now what that verse is talking about there, Jesus didn't take on the form of an angel, right, to redeem the fallen angels. He took on the form of man, the seed of Abraham, to redeem mankind. That's what happens. there. And so angels can't be redeemed. They've fallen away from God with Satan. Now, these demons that he talks about in 1 Peter here, they're bound in hell. So their only hope of being forever free from the bonds of hell is if what happens? Who has to win in order for them to get out? Satan has to win for them to get out. For them to get out. Satan has to win. That's their only hope of ever getting out of hell. And the others from being condemned to the lake of fire is if Satan wins. Now, this was one of those attempts, the cross. Now, of course, it has failed because Jesus is still alive. Even though he bore the sin of the world, he was already punished for sin. He's not condemned to eternal death, the second death, like the unsaved people of the world would be who reject Christ. He has surpassed that, came out victorious on the other end, and now he's proclaiming them to them at this time in this place. Now, there are other attempts that Satan has made to try to cause God's plan to fail. We know that. One of those was trying to prevent Jesus' birth. We talked about that. A person, if they were espoused, that was a legally binding agreement. It's much more drastic than an engagement today, because if you were espoused to a woman or a man, the only way to disannul that was to get a divorce. You couldn't undo that without a divorce. It was the same as if a person was married, just you didn't have a physical relationship yet. And of course, when Joseph is espoused to Mary, she turns up pregnant. Now, your average person would assume what? She's been unfaithful. She's committed. It was still considered adultery because it's a legally binding agreement there. What was the punishment for adultery for God's people? Death, stoned to death. Right? Could have had her stoned to death at that time. And what would have happened to the Christ child that she was carrying? He would have died. And so that was one attempt. But, of course, Joseph was not going to do that. He was going to put her away privately. But had he not chose to do that, and had he not believed the angel's message that this is of the Holy Ghost, she hasn't cheated on you, she hasn't been unfaithful, she hasn't committed adultery, had he not believed that, that could have happened. And so you see there that Satan was working behind the scenes, but that failed. There was another attempt to try to stop God's plan right after Jesus' birth. You remember? Herod is trying to, when he finds out from the wise men that they've come to worship the King of the Jews, right? And he says, you go find him, come back and tell me that I can come worship him too. And of course God warns the wise men not to return back, and then he tries to have all the babies killed in that area to try to kill the King of the Jews, to kill the Christ child. That was another attempt of Satan, which also failed. Satan tried multiple times during Jesus' life to do the same thing at the temptations in the wilderness, with the Jews who tried to kill Jesus outside of the prophecies. We talk about that multiple times. Had they stoned Jesus, that would have wrecked God's plan of salvation, because the prophecies all said that Jesus had to be what? Had to be crucified. He had to be pierced. That's crucifixion from Psalm 22. And so if they'd stoned him to death, he would have died, but not the way God said that he was to die. And that would have wrecked that. But of course that failed also. Satan only has to get God to fail once. Just one time. If he can wreck one thing in God's plan, then he can wreck the whole plan. That's how he hopes to win the victory. But it can't happen. Satan will again try in Revelation 12. You can go read that for yourself. I believe that's when the rapture occurs, is when I personally believe that happens in order of time. There, when Christ comes back to get his church, and Satan and his angels revolt again, and that revolt is put down. And after that point in time, they are no longer free to be in the heavens. After that point in time, Satan and all his demons are confined to the earth. And then he remains here until he's cast, bound in the bottomless pit, and then cast into the lake of fire. But God will release during the tribulation period. You can read that also in Revelation chapter 9. God releases some of those demons out into the earth, and they just cause all kinds of havoc, take on the form of locusts. Locust lifespan is 5 months. They torment mankind for 5 months. And if you go back and read that account, you'll find the people that are stung by them want to die. That's how miserable it is. But they don't. They can't. It's just torment. 5 months of that. And that's through the demons that come out of hell. And I believe that's another attempt there that fails. And at the close of the tribulation, Satan's bound for 1,000 years. After the 1,000 years, he's released for a short period of time. He gathers all his host, all of those on the earth that have rejected Christ during the millennial kingdom, to have one last attempt to overthrow Christ. Fire comes down from heaven, consumes them, and that's the end of it. And they're cast into the lake of fire there. But all of death and hell and the ungodly are cast in at that time, and the ultimate victory begins. That's the eternal kingdom. That's when Christ sets up the eternal kingdom here on the purified earth. Everything becomes heaven here at that time. Now look at 1 Peter 3, verse 19. He says, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. The word for prison there is describing the place, not the condition of those that are there. We were all prisoners to sin, if you will, before we got saved. That's not this word. Of all the unholy angels, though, as we said, this is probably directed more to them. The others get to hear it, but it's probably directed to the fallen angels there, or just hoping Satan wins there and gets them out of there somehow. But all the unholy angels or demons, there are two kinds. There are those who are loose for now, and there are those who are bound in hell. Luke chapter 8, verse 30. Look over there for just a second. You see. There's the fear of that, though. Those who are free can be bound. God can cause them to be bound in hell, and so they're kind of walking a thin line. They want to do as much as they can against God without being cast into hell and bound there. Luke 8, 30 and 31, he says, and Jesus asked him, saying, what is thy name? And he said, Legion, because many devils were entered into him. And they besought him that he would not command them to go out into the deep. Now, what is the deep? That's the abyss. That's a word for hell. The pits of hell there. They're not wanting to be bound like some of the other demons are at this time there. And so they're doing all that they can, but they don't want to cross the line and have to be cast in there and bound there. And how does a demon go from being loose to being bound? Because that's obviously happened. Well, 1 Peter 3:20 there, if you look back at our original text, you see how that actually happens. In 1 Peter 3, verse 20, which sometime were disobedient when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was a-preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. Now, those demons that are bound in hell have disobeyed God. Disobeyed God. Now you say, well, haven't all of the fallen angels disobeyed God? Well, they rebelled against God for certain. They were cast out of heaven, a third of them. But this is talking about after that point in time. These that are bound have gone outside of the limits that God sets for them. You remember, they are accountable to God still. They can only do what God allows them to do. If they try to go past that point, what happens? They're bound. They're cast into hell with the rest of them that are bound. And this stems back, you see an example here in 1 Peter, from the days of Noah. Now, what were the demons trying to do at that time in history? Well, they're trying to wreck God's plan of salvation redemption also. And one way for them to do that would be to take over the whole world and kill all the righteous. That's one way. Right? Get rid of God's chosen people, the Jews, right? And kill all of them. Back in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1, you see how this happens. We'll read a few verses while we're over there. But Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1. They want to take over the world, destroy the righteous from it. Galatians 6, 1 and 2 says this, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." Now the sons of God is a reference to angels. Job 1:6, you see that again. He says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord." The angels are accountable to God. There, and at the end of that verse it says, "And Satan came also among them." Even the most powerful angel of God's creation, Satan himself, is still accountable to God with all the other sons of God, all the other angelic beings there. Now, back in Genesis 6, the demons have to occupy a body in order to procreate. They're, as far as we can tell, all male. There aren't female angels and male angels. They're all male. And so they don't have the ability to procreate. They can't have offspring. They're spiritual beings. In order for them to do that, they have to possess a body of a human being. And that's how they do that. Now what's going on here is they are trying to possess of mankind the strongest, the biggest, the best of all of mankind. Right? And then you see there, then verse 2 of Genesis 2, they just start fornicating with all the women that they can find. They take all the wives that they can get, and they're just trying to multiply as fast as they can in that process there. They're trying to breed a super race is what they're trying to breed. Somebody that the other humans on the earth can't compare to. They'll be bigger, they'll be stronger, they'll be more powerful, and they'll be able to kill them. That's the purpose there. In Genesis 6, 4 and 5, you see this. It's working. It's working. That's what Genesis 6, 4 and 5 is talking about. He says, "There were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." So these demon-possessed men, they possess the strongest, the biggest, all that. And so what's happening there when they start having children with the women there, they start becoming giants. They're huge. They're powerful there. They become mighty men, infamous for their size and for their strength, and people that the rest, an average-sized person, wouldn't be able to contend with in battle. And then the wickedness grows. Now, God isn't oblivious to what Satan is trying to accomplish through these demons. Right in the middle of that, in Genesis 6:3, we see this verse. "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And so God says, I'm going to let it go for another 120 years. Breed all you can. Possess all the, get all the giants that you can. In 120 years, it's going to be over. And he's actually allowing Satan 120 years to try to take over the earth there. And of course, during that time, what is Noah doing? Building an ark. And what else? Preaching. He's preaching. He's warning about the coming judgment. And he has this huge object lesson now. This ark that he's building to try to teach that to them. And God is the provider of salvation. God is the one who's developed the plan to build the ark to save mankind there. and He is the only way of life. And if they don't accept that way, they'll be condemned to death in hell. That's the message that Noah is preaching. Now, 8 souls entered the ark. And who shuts the door? God shuts the door. Noah doesn't shut the door. God is the one that seals them in. And so God shuts the door. Even the mightiest, even the strongest of the giants on the earth. What happens when the rain starts falling and the waters from the deep start breaking up? What happened to all of those? They drowned. They drowned with the puny little people just like me. It didn't matter how strong they were, how big they were. They still drowned. That's the picture there. And so from Peter's letter here, we know that some of the demons were bound at that time because they've gone past what God would allow them to do and trying to take over the earth and do those type of things there. And so they're bound. Right? Now, I think a lot of them were bound at that time. But when God did that at that time, and He bound at least some of them there, that may have been all it took to kind of keep the fear in the rest of them. The rest of the demons who are still loose to operate in the world, and they're afraid of that same fate, just like the ones there from Luke that we read that were afraid of being put into the deep or the abyss, bound there. And so, but when Moses dies, you remember God has a special purpose for his body. I believe that's because he's supposed to be one of the 2 witnesses to come back to the earth. I believe it's he and Elijah. But we understand there that God is going to use 2 witnesses. But you see there, after Moses' death, Michael, the archangel, is fighting with Satan for the body. In Jude 1:9, you see this: "Yet Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, does not bring against him a railing accusation, but said, The Lord rebuke thee." Now all Michael has to do is threaten Satan with the rebuke of God, and that's all it takes. He gets the body. I think it's like one of these. You want to go to hell and be bound with the rest of them? Keep it up. I'm not going to fight over you with this. He just says, if you want me to tell God about this, we'll go there. And you can tell there's that fear there, because some have already went through that. Now look at 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4 and 5. We'll pick up a few verses over here too. But 2 Peter 2, 4 and 5. He says, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment," that's the being bound, those that are bound. Verse 5, "And spared not the old world, but saved Noah the 8th person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly." Now, Peter mentions this again in his second letter to this same group there, when those demons are bound in hell, and he uses the reference to Noah's day, that they've disobeyed God, they've gone past God's limit, and they were bound in hell during that time. And then he adds another time, and this is probably another time where some of those demons were bound in hell. In that next verse in 2 Peter 2, 6 and 7, he says this: "And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that after should live ungodly, and delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked." Now it's this same picture, right? And then you see some other examples following that. If you skip down to verse 17 of 2 Peter 2, you see the fate. He said, "These are wells without water, clouds that are carried with a tempest, to whom the mist of darkness is reserved forever." He's talking about demons there who are forever bound. They're not going to be released ever. They'll go straight from hell, straight to the lake of fire there. And so those demons at that time had possessed some of the men of that wicked cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. You remember when God sends the two angels there, who look like men at that time, when God sends those two men to warn Lot, take him and his family out there so he can destroy those cities. You remember what those people were wanting to do to the two angels. They wanted to rape them, sodomize them. And that's that picture there. And so imagine these bound demons. I believe those people who tried that from those cities were bound at that time too. That's why Peter gives that example there. But now, imagine now when you look back at 1 Peter chapter 3 again, imagine these bound demons that Christ is now proclaiming his victory to there. They're in the pits of hell. They're hoping that the crucifixion will be their chance at freedom, and then Jesus shows up. And then their hope is crushed again there. And he proclaims the victory instead. Christ has the keys to what? Death, hell, and the grave. He's got the keys to those. Now, I believe at that time when Christ goes down and proclaims the victory, I believe that's when the Old Testament saints get their new bodies. They're led out of paradise when Christ leaves. You see them in the New Testament there. Some of them are walking around Jerusalem there. They've got a body again there and come to earth for a time. And I believe they return to heaven when he does. I don't believe the paradise side in the earth has residence now. I believe they're all with Christ in heaven. Ephesians 4:8 and 9. Paul gives the same description that Peter's giving here. I believe these same events. In Ephesians 4:8 and 9, he says, "Wherefore he saith, when he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men." So I believe that when he takes those Old Testament saints with him, that they get their rewards eternally there. Verse 9, "Now that he ascended, what is it but that he also descended first into the lower parts of the earth?" And that's what Peter's talking about. He goes down there to hell, proclaims the victory, and then brings the Old Testament saints out. But he has to go there first and proclaim the victory. That's the fulfillment of the prophecy from Psalm 68:18. If you're curious about that was prophesied. But Colossians 2. Look over in Colossians, and we'll close over here. We'll see more of this next time. But Colossians 2 in verse 14 says this. Colossians 2:14. "Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross." Now, in this time in history, when a person was accused of a crime and they were imprisoned, for instance, they would write those crimes on a sign, nail it to the door of the prison there, and a person could tell this person's in prison for theft, or this one's in prison for something else, whatever the crime was, and they'd have that sign attached to the prison cell. Now, if a person was killed for their crime, what did they do with that? Same thing. They nailed the accusation, the crime that they committed, to the cross. And that would be there. That's what they posted on Jesus' cross. What did they accuse him of? Being the king of the Jews. Trying to be a king in the Roman Empire, even though Pilate knew that was not happening. They had to have some type of valid accusation, whether it was true or not, to put on the cross there. And the picture here from Colossians 2:14 is that the accusations against us, the sins, the crimes against us that we committed, right, there, we should have died for those. We should have been killed for those. Jesus took our sins, our crimes, and nailed them where? To his cross. To his cross there. So he's punished for them. Our crimes are then what? Blotted out, erased, like they've never existed there. And so we can't be punished for them anymore. If you're still there in Colossians 2, look at verse 15. He says, and having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a shew of them openly, triumphing over them in it. What are principalities and powers? Those are different ranks of angels. Those are different ranks of angels. And so demons in this instance, because he made a shew of them openly. He goes openly to the spirits that are in prison, those who are bound there in hell, and triumphing over them in it. He proclaims the victory to them, the exact same message that Peter's talking about there. They're defeated again, and yet they still have hope. Even the demons in hell still have hope that somehow, some way, Satan will win. He'll get God to mess up just one time, and they can be free. And there's still that little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, that little bit of hope, even though it's vain hope, right? But only after they're swallowed up in the lake of fire, where the sight is completely gone. It's blackness forever. After that point in time, the hope's gone. It's vain hope now for them, but at that point their hope is completely gone. And of course that's not only true for the demons in hell, it's true for the people who are there now too. And once they're cast into the lake of fire, they'll realize we're eternally separated from God in darkness to be tormented forever. Okay, we'll see more next time, Lord willing. Any questions or comments this evening?